What are the challenges for women working on the sports beat? We'll tackle that topic next on a special edition of Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Mark Rosenwig, Associate Professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. The drive for equality for women in sports extends from the playing field to the press box to the studio and the remote truck. Over the last 3 decades, women have made progress working on the sports beat, but that progress has been gradual, and there are still challenges today for women covering sports. We explored those challenges during a panel discussion at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center on the MSU campus. Our panel included Annie Sundberg, who directed the film Let Them Wear Towels on the early experiences of women in sports media for the ESPN 9 for 9 series, and Tara Sullivan, sports reporter and columnist for the Record newspaper. Sullivan talked about one experience with a male reporter in the workplace that she found very unpleasant.
So the old Yankee Stadium had this angled press box, where the rows of writers going up, and I happened to be sitting in maybe the third row, and I could see the writers in the row right in front of me laughing over a computer, and this one guy was calling people over and look at this and look at this, and when they moved I could see it was pornography, and it was, blatant, and it was graphic, I will say. And I kept sitting there thinking, like, this just can't be going on in here. And then at one point, one of them turned and said something to me about something completely unrelated, and I reacted very angrily, like, you've got to be kidding me. I'm not talking to you now with this going on. And then the reporter in question, he's not even in the business anymore. His name was Larry Rocca. He worked for Newsday at the time. Turned it back on me and started yelling at me that I was reading his screen. So I was in the wrong because I was reading his screen, which is an issue sometimes in a press box. Somebody might have a breaking story on their screen if somebody walks by and they be accused of stealing the information or whatever. So I was just livid. And I was so angry, and I was angry because there were other reporters who agreed with his thinking that I was in the wrong, and I just said, listen, I'm not here to be your moralist, I'm not a prude, I don't care what you do at home, but this is my workspace too, and that's not appropriate in my workspace. And I will say, the Yankees agreed with me. The president of the Baseball Writers New York chapter was there at the time, Jack Curry, and he knew that I was in the right. But it was so distressing to me at the time because that whole turning it back on me was just so classically victimize a victim. Not that I felt, like a victim, but just turning it back on the person who had the audacity to complain about the inappropriateness of it. And honestly, some of my colleagues, I remember one in particular who I had known for a long time. We were riding in the elevator, and I remember him saying, like, you don't want to get on his bad side, because there was like a group of baseball writers. Baseball press boxes, trust me, are still more hostile than the locker room has ever been. They're just like a little boys' club. It has a real fraternity atmosphere at times. And I just looked at this friend of mine and I said, he should be worried about hanging out with me. I'm pissed off. And I remember even the next day I wasn't assigned to be at Yankee Stadium, and I went anyway, because there was no way I was going to let these guys be comfortable in their own skin. And it just, listen, in the long run, he's out of the business, I'm still here, so that makes me happy. But it just shocked me that people thought that was appropriate in a workplace.
Yeah.
But in both of your experiences, you've come across, I'm sure, women who have said, I don't want to work in that environment anymore. I'm a talented writer and reporter. I need to get on to another beat. I think Jane Gross moved to another beat.
Well, the woman who was with me at the time was a sports reporter, Ursula Reel was her name. She was a wonderful sports reporter. She was working for the New York Post at the time, and she ultimately left the business. And I think not that particular incident, but that type of atmosphere contributed to her decision to leave.
So have we lost too many talented people to the profession because of this, do you think?
I think there's been a higher rate of turnover in women journalists than there have been in men. I think that some people have also talked about just getting burnt out as well, and whether it's
which is indicative of the business in general.
Right.
But I can't say I know that many, but a small fraction of a small number to begin with. So I don't, I don't know how to characterize that in the larger sense.
What about the group you started out with, your so-called contemporaries, when you think about that?
No, I have to say I could think of as many men who were burned out and left the job as I can think of women. You know, my college roommate and I ran the newspaper together, Kelly Whiteside, and we both have stuck in the business, and she's a lead reporter at USA Today.
I mean, my gut is that the good sports reporters, regardless of gender, are going to stay in there because they love it and they feel committed to doing what they love, and they, you know, and they know they're good at it, and they're not going to leave because of those kinds of incidents. I think that it's a general choice probably for lifestyle down the line, which is what it came down to for many of the women who were in our film. You're just tired of being on the road all the time.
Yeah, that's why I never really chose baseball as a beat, you know, because of the
there are issues of,
travel.
family
Yeah,
and so on,
exactly.
which men may not face in the same manner.
Right, but
And that's
do
across
recall
industries, too, I
Another
think.
one, Bill Pennington is a great friend of mine, was a longtime reporter at The Record where I work, columnist, and works at the New York Times. And I remember him talking to me about his early years on the Yankee beat when he was with The Record, and something about his wife. And I said, my goodness, how did you survive in a beat writer? He said, well, this is my second wife. And he said if every beat writer that he knew at the time, of course they were all men back then, every single one of them was divorced.
Yeah.
And I said, that's a very high price to pay, you know, and that's the reason that, listen, do people leave the industry? People make choices for a lot of different reasons. So I can't say personally that I'm aware of a higher incidence of women leaving because of maybe negative atmosphere in the locker room. It's exactly as you said, like if you're committed and love doing it, you overcome that stuff. I mean, listen, we're focusing on some of the harder times for women in sports journalism. The flip side is, you know, I think today's world is full of wonderful sports journalists, female, and you know, and I think of some of the columnists that I read, you know, the Christine Brennan at the USA Today, you know, just really good people out there. So I like to still, my mind likes to flip it positive at the same time and think about the good people out there too.
And it seems to be we're seeing a lot of reporting about many social issues. With women's issues, the LGBT community.
Absolutely.
You were covering Jason Collins last night and so on. How has that expanded and really broadened your horizons and your colleagues' horizons at this point?
I mean, culture changes eventually. Sports is reflective so much of the rest of society. I often tell young journalists, if you can work in sports, you can cover anything because we deal with social issues, we deal with crime, we deal with human interests, we deal with news breaking. You know, you really have. There used to be an old joke in journalism that it was the toy department of the newspaper, but that's so unfair because you can do everything if you work in a sports department. So
no, there's big money, there's corporate investigation, there's everything.
There's cheating scandals, there's memorabilia. I'm telling you, you could come across any kind of story in sports. So I think the fact that sports is that microcosm of all these other issues has been an amazing writing opportunity for me. The things that I get to cover and write about the issues that matter to me that I then get to share with the public through a sports lens, I think is great. The current one with LGBT is just, that happens to be one that is changing so rapidly right now. I heard a great line last night at the Nets game that an issue that nobody even used to talk about, now leagues are fighting to be seen as the most inclusive. In the span of like
6
a year.
months?
So I think that's great.
Are you aware of the organization Athlete Ally? That's
yes,
been very,
that one, and there's another one you can play. You know, these different groups, and it's just amazing. You know, that's to me is
yeah. We should say that the Gar Museum has a relationship and a display with Athlete Ally. And
there you go.
In the fall, we did a panel here discussing the LGBT community in sports. But you're right. It's interesting that in a short period of time, these leagues are embracing it. Of course, not to be too crass, but they sold how many jerseys of Jason Collins
Absolutely.
jerseys?
Well, listen,
number 98.
They're not going to turn away. It's been fascinating to me at this particular time. HBO has been showing the movie 42 over and over and over again. So I've seen it a million times. So it's just, it reminds you of being in the middle of the change, you know, and that's what I feel like on many issues in sports. We've managed to be in the middle of seeing a change. I think I was even after the middle of the change for women's access. You know, I came at a time when other people had sort of done it for me. But this thing now, acceptance of openly gay athletes in locker rooms in the 4 major sports, like I feel like we're in the middle of it. I find that exhilarating as a writer because I feel like that's something we're part of, sort of moving that forward.
Well, we should probably assume there's a filmmaker behind the scenes with Jason Collins right now, and
I'm sure
we'll
there is.
I saw a lot of cameras last night.
We'll see when that comes out to us.
Yeah.
Yep.
You brought up Scandal, though, so we have to talk about Scandal and a woman who unearthed Scandal, and that That's the reporter Selena Roberts. And I just want to remind everybody about the story that she broke. Very serious sports reporter. Several years ago, she broke the story for Sports Illustrated that Alex Rodriguez was one of 104 Major League Baseball players who tested positive for steroids back in 2003. And of course, he later admitted taking them in the interview with Peter Gammons. During the interview, though, A-Rod said the following, quote, "What makes me upset is that Sports Illustrated pays this lady, Selena Roberts, to stalk me," unquote. He went on to make specific allegations about stalking by her at her home, his homes in Miami and New York. She denied the allegations, and later A-Rod did apologize to her. Harvey Araton, who teaches with us and comes here often, in his Times column at the time said, quote, "If a man had broken the steroid story, would he have been demonized as a social deviant when all he was doing was due diligence? Would he have been subjected to a cross-examination of his intentions and ethics by too many in the news media who he felt didn't stand up for her?" What's your view of this and the fact that it hasn't completely gone away, right?
No.
Oh, no. We were just,
I mean, my initial take on that is that Rodriguez is falling back on the closed culture. It's the clubhouse. Again, that was originally going to be the title of our film, which I would have preferred in some ways, but it was so baseball specific. There's this tightly, it's a community of men. They protect each other. They protect each other's secrets. You certainly saw it with Lance and his team with cycling. And I do think that he was demonizing an outsider, who is an outsider in particular by gender. And I don't think he felt called to task in the same way that he would have had it been a male reporter. And I think that exists. I think there's this automatic assumption that, and I love this, you could never play my sport. You are not a man. You could never be in my shoes. You could never be here. So you don't deserve to write about it. You can't understand this.
that is utterly, absolutely common. And I usually tell people, well, the guy who delivered my children was a man, and he never had a baby, and I trusted him to do it. I mean, the notion, people that cover the White House have never been president. I mean, this notion that you somehow had to have played the sport, that one gets me more.
But it does exist.
Oh,
and
absolutely,
I think
it exists.
And I think there's the absolute outward fact of gender difference, and I think it makes it much easier for someone like Rodriguez to demonize Selena in that case. And I
Well,
think that,
this is
Yeah.
part of what we do deal with, there's no doubt. When Brandy Chastain won the World Cup with a penalty shot, famous, and took her jersey off and had the sports, why was she stripping in so many stories? Like that, I find, there's this easy leap. There's, like you said, it's a way to just see women that way. And what I think underscores the way that Harvey reacted, I think, properly to that story, I think of TJ Quinn, who is an excellent investigative reporter on ESPN and who had worked at the New York Daily News, and he broke much of the Barry Bonds, what was going on in the grand jury. And he recently actually divulged through Twitter a series of tweets how he broke that story. He overheard, literally was standing outside a door that they afterwards locked off and blocked off and eavesdropped. If a woman had done that, I do think it would have been presented differently or perceived differently. But at the same time, I notice that it's done differently. Do I get personally angry? Not so much. I just feel like that's the way. That's going to be part of the drill.
And I think the only thing that's going to happen is this slow generational cultural shifting that you're starting to see. We're seeing it with Collins. We're seeing it with, I'm amazed at how much has happened in the past 6 months. And I do think that there will be a certain, who knows where we'll be in a year and a half, 2 years. And it's just, but I do think that there's still this old school fallback that this is our space, it is not your space, and there's still a gender line, in particular with baseball.
Is there a concern that some female reporters might not report something or pursue something because they feel they might be demonized because of the nature of it?
I
I'm not
guess you
saying
could always
you, I know
say it
you
as a
would.
concern. I think it comes back to, as you pointed out and used that great expression about sort of institutional support. I think if you've come up with good teachers and good journalism examples and you have good editors, that no, you wouldn't be, because you just would realize that that's part of the job. That is a difficult part of the job, breaking stories that people aren't going to like.
Although I do think that some of the stories that we'd heard from, Leslie and Robin in early days, Robin is so strong-minded, I don't think she ever thought this way. Leslie was a little bit more, she sort of understood the nuances of certain things. There were certain things you didn't cover if you wanted to have your foot in the locker room. There was early on, there were certain things that you did not.
A lot of that still goes on. I went to the NFL Combine it's like spring break for the NFL.
Right.
You know, coaches are out in bars and that at night when it's, you know, an off the record situation in the sense that it's not an organized media event, but, you know, media and coaches and that are all interacting. You know, there are things I'm sure that happen there that could get reported.
Yeah,
on.
it's tricky because I do think being a sports reporter, there's certain things that could result in being blacklisted in ways that other industries don't have that. I think that there's an assumption
right,
of trust.
because we're sort of going into
Don't
their
betray
space
me.
and hanging in
Yeah.
their locker room. That is, but that goes for all sports reporters.
Yeah.
There's sort of
All sports.
sometimes, a line you try to figure out and not cross. Like you don't get into somebody's personal life necessarily unless it crosses into criminal behavior. You know,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
So I hope it's not driving people out of the business.
But
No.
we're seeing more of that lately because of Twitter and Facebook and so on. Reporters are becoming aware, and the public is becoming aware of things, whether it's Tiger Woods' situation with the mistresses. I remember we had a discussion here about that with a bunch of sports reporters, and you know, it was like nobody wanted to touch it at first because it was a National Enquirer story.
Right.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden the car goes into the fire hydrant and his wife is out in the street with a golf club and there's a broken window. Suddenly there's a police report.
Yeah.
But people are reluctant to get into these things.
But I think
Yeah.
that that's when it becomes fair game. Again, to a certain degree, when you're starting to deal with it, how it impacts people on the public side of things. I
Well,
think
that's
that
it.
there's
And, you know, when Tiger presented using the media to his advantage and absolutely every right to, you know, presenting a certain version of himself to the public as this type of person, and then, you know, something comes along to counteract that. I do think that the public has a right there, because I feel like, you know, it was Tiger who put a certain image out there, and then you realize, you know, it's Alex who said, I never did steroids, you know,
Right.
and then evidence came to the contrary. Like when they put something out there a certain way and then there's evidence that goes the other way, I just think that as journalists that's complete fair game
Right.
then. But going after somebody's, you know, a personal life, if they've never once spoken about, you know, never put that out in the public, maybe that's a little tougher one to do.
I also just think there's this general issue of access with professional athletes where there's been this celebrity culture that's come into athletics that has not existed. You know, I think there was
great
probably a purer period of sport when most of the sports were covered in the papers, where people really got their download on the morning news, you know, over
Yeah.
their coffee and their breakfast. And now, because of sponsors, because of television opportunities, because of everything else, it's a bit of a media circus. And I think that there's a lot of consciousness of image. We found this when we started down the path of knuckleball, where someone like R.A. Dickey, who is a film lover and really understands the process, was far more open to the filming, you know, really took on the journey of making a documentary. Someone like Tim Wakefield, who's been a professional athlete for his entire life, you know, who's really played, you know, at the highest levels, much more wary, considers filmmakers and journalists on the same level, and I'm going to give you this much in sound bites. And it took a long journey with him to get him to a place where he actually became more fully human, you know, in front of the camera. And I was thinking about how the access that we have and the stories that we can try to tell in sports are still restricted by this particular, I'm creating a celebrity image of myself within the sports world. Alex Gibney, perfect example. He was sort of, when he was making, the Lance Armstrong lie, the film, he originally went in there and he basically, you know, he even says in his film, he kind of drank the Kool-Aid. You become close to, you become an enabler of that athlete and their stories and their images and everything else, and that gets you further access because it's a mutual situation. They're
Absolutely.
getting their image promoted, you're getting
Inside
something that
access
feels
or
like
some-
inside access.
yeah.
And you often, if you start scratching below the surface, that access
Right.
goes away.
Well, and we all know that somebody, when the reporter noticed the Dean Dion and Mark McGuire's locker, you know, that just
Yeah.
started the whole floodgate. But for a
Yeah.
long time, that stuff had been there for years. People just, didn't scratch that.
And we always wonder how many of them saw it and turned the other way.
That's, you
And
know.
the person who did finally write about it was
Yeah.
criticized and ostracized to a
Right,
certain
at
extent.
the beginning for saying
Yeah.
you've crossed the line, seeing something that, you know. I remember that even one time Alex Rodriguez in his locker had this stack of sort of self-help motivational books and
Could have used a PR book too.
but even having the debate with other writers, like, is that fair game? You know, because it
Right.
does tell you something, it illuminates something about Alex Rodriguez, and that, as a writer, that's what I want to do more than anything, is illuminate something about him.
Well, it's a public place. It should be
That's-
fair game.
and that's why
Yeah.
that-
I would have said it's fair
ultimately.
game. R.A. Dickey had his books in there, and that became lots of press
Yeah.
for, you know,
Yep.
R.A.
So-
Dickey's the poet of the mess.
Exactly, but there is, you know, some people do see that differently, but in some ways you have to be careful of drinking the Kool-Aid. I've known plenty of reporters
Well,
over the
you know,
years.
speaking of that, we had a situation with Bodie Miller at the Olympics
Right.
recently, where a female reporter asked him a series of questions about his brother who had died and dedicating the race to his brother. And a lot of people felt that she went too far, she didn't know when to stop, and so on.
There was a social media cultural shaming that happened for
which
her
I
in
thought
that
was
situation.
Completely out of bounds. I
But
didn't
then
think
he
she went to-
apparently turned around and said,
Yeah.
you know, I think she's a good reporter. This is not the exact quote, but I,
Yeah,
you know,
he
I wasn't
don't-
offended by
right,
it and
I
so
wasn't
on.
angry
But
or upset.
you know, it turned out too that he knew her for a long time. I guess she had
Yeah, she
covered
was
him
a
on the
former ski racer, I
racing
think, as well,
and so
yeah.
on. And we had Kelly Tileman, who's the Golf Channel a few years ago, made some comments. This is not the exact quote, but he basically, Tiger Woods, I think, was way ahead in a tournament, and she said, well, you know, short of a lynching, nothing is going to stop him from
Right.
winning or something like that. And certainly that was not perceived well, but he knew her and felt he knew her, that her intent was not
Right.
wrong, and he came out and
Defended her.
said, you know, this is not something I'm concerned about. And that,
Right.
that made a difference. But those are two examples where the people had a closeness.
The understanding between them, yeah.
And it you know, it kind of put it into
And
context.
let me just say, her questions didn't go too far. Bodie Miller has been, you know, for so long, the guy hardly gave the media anything, you know, and he was, clearly he was comfortable talking about it, he was opening up, he was sharing. I just thought I did not think she went too far.
I think people felt
so.
the cameraman went too far. I think that it was almost the fact that his personal space was being so encroached in that
Maybe that's
heartbreaking
how it
moment.
came across,
Yeah.
and that's why, I don't know, but I was
Yeah.
taken aback at how much she was criticized
Yeah.
for that interview, because that raw emotion from Bodie Miller is just not something that we've seen often, and I thought that's what she recognized. Wow, here's a guy sharing things that we just really haven't heard him share to that degree before,
Yeah.
so let me
Yeah,
get
and
as
the-
much
and the
as
other,
I can.
The other point being, as an interviewer, you ask people questions, and if they're still responding to them, he could turn around and say, that's
Absolutely.
enough, and,
Right.
and I'm leaving, and so on. One of the criticisms was this was a recorded interview and should it have been edited down, and so on. And the argument on the other side is, well, then you lose the whole
Right.
context.
Well, Erin Andrews was so killed for that Richard Sherman interview right after the NFC Championship game, when he started yelling into the camera about not, you know, don't test me, whatever. And I mean, and her one follow-up was, you know, who were you talking about? Which I thought was the perfect question at that moment, because he was saying, don't talk about me, don't talk about. Not everybody knew who he was talking about, and she, you know, killed. And again, you know, I think there's some level of judging by a different standard, because she's a female sideline reporter, and
Right.
people tend to assume, well, she's probably there because she's blonde, and you know, and it's just unfair. I thought that it was the right question under the right circumstance.
And she's now crossed over. She's going to be co-host of Dancing
I
with the
saw that.
Stars.
Yeah, she's
But she went through a very trying situation when there were nude photos of her taken through
Yeah.
a peephole in a hotel room, and
well, that culture of celebrity that you mentioned.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes it's so much more about the athletes, and that's changed the salaries they make. You know, they're in a completely different stratosphere. You go back to when people covered our namesake Yogi Berra. You know, they lived in the same neighborhoods and worked the same jobs. It's not like that anymore. But that culture of celebrity has crossed over in some degree to sportscasters, and
Right.
it's like a table turning thing. Sometimes it's very odd, and she's expanded. She's done great. She does more than just sports. So.
But does a woman at this point in the public eye like that on television sacrifice certain privacy, personal things? Does that have to be accepted to a reasonable degree at this
Well,
point, or is that
I feel like that's
wrong?
just the price of fame across the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, everybody talks about that. There's a moment when a piece of you becomes part of the public. It's
Yeah, I
the
mean,
blessing
you
and the
shouldn't.
curse of choosing certain.
Absolutely. I know when Rutgers was going through a lot of scandals, and I happen to be a Rutgers graduate, but I was writing, you know, very critical pieces about Rutgers, and I know that some of the reaction by Rutgers people was particularly personally angry, directed at me, but I knew that going in. Like, I know they're going to I'm putting myself out there, so now they're going to judge me coming back. Why are you writing this? So I do think that's on a much, much smaller scale, but I think you are aware of that. You're entering the public domain, certainly, so you have to be
What
aware.
advice do you both have for our students today? If there are young women in the audience in our classes and so on that are considering a career in sports media, do you recommend it at this point?
Well, I feel like the media landscape is shifting so much. It's less about recommending any anything in particular and trying to figure out what's the best medium for what you want to do, because there's so many different platforms now, and I think print journalism is its own thing. I think that, I hate to say it, but I look at opportunities within NFL and I don't think there are that many. I do think that there are other opportunities for women. Know the game, know which game you want to cover. You know, are you going to be a generalist? Is there one particular beat?
Well, I would say, first of all, I would wholeheartedly recommend the
Yeah.
profession. If you love sports as much as I do, listen, you're getting paid to watch sports for a living, something I'd be doing anyway. Like that part, I will never lose my enthusiasm for that part of the
Yeah.
job. I personally think going forward, exactly what you said, this is the generation that's going to figure out how sports continues to be covered as it goes forward, what the outlets are, how stories are told. So one, be challenged by that, find things, find ways to tell stories, be well versed in all kinds of media, know the game, obviously. I mean, don't come into sports if you don't know anything about it. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And just, I think being specialized as we go forward is the way to move ahead and to find your niche. Now, I happen to be a general columnist, which there just aren't that many more left of what I do. I think if you're an NFL expert, an NHL expert, a soccer expert, a tennis expert, whatever it might be, that's the way, more so, I think, going forward, that the job opportunities would be there.
Despite the challenges of being a woman on the sports beat, many sports journalists like Tara Sullivan are encouraged by the progress women have made in the profession over the last 3 decades. Thanks to our panelists, Annie Sundberg and Tara Sullivan, and special thanks to Dave Kaplan at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center for hosting our panel. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@mail.montclair.edu or call 973-655-5158. I'm Mark Rosenwig from all of us at Montclair State University. Thanks for watching Carpe Diem.